So, Objector has been released. The situation is dire. We must take action to stop him. But knowing this Necroverse is against me, I'm going to assimilate these mortals plotting to overthrow me. The Zynektic World War begins.
Boy, what a war it'll be.
Welcome back, Obscure Titan, with the final installment of the original Zynektic series, though we'll be looking at Godzilla vs. the Zynektiverse afterwards at another time. We've covered all three novels that were worked on between late 2018 and mid-2019. I was burnt out to work on the final installment in the series and had Mortal Brothers 2019 on the spotlight more often. But as things in the Mortal Brothers 2019 canon settled down for a little while until February 2021, I went back to working on the Zynektic series. This time, it gets to have an extension of 17 chapters rather than limiting them to just 7 or 9 like last time. It was a big deal back then because it would have Objector and Zynektos as antagonists. This also meant that the majority of the series' roster would appear as if it were an all-star royale. Well, not everyone. Blue Kaizak and King Golok died if anyone saw my novel summary videos. Another thing to note is that all the illustrations I drew are all in black and white. You can tell why they all looked similar despite the depth and shading added to them. But that's all personal preference, am I right? We'll start with a recap of the previous 3 novels to get anyone who hasn't seen my 3 videos get caught up, and then we'll get started to the actual novel. Links for the novels in the description, as well as for the videos. Without further ado, let's go to war! To start this recap off, the Zynektic legend took place on Juvanbox 293410 when Jabe and Syra were on an adventure to face off against Okmo-Ziko. The warlord's plan was to turn Purans and other species into machines so that the Zynektic plague would have no effect on them, essentially removing emotion as an indication, which would have turned them into monsters or died. 2 years after Jabe defeated Okmo-Ziko, Zyboglia sought after minerals for his personal use, including light Zynekity. Jabe and her allies set out to stop him from accomplishing his goal, in which he would have released Objector without knowing or caring about it. In the midst of all the chaos, Zynektos sends out his general to warn their enemies of his coming. A year after, a samurai warrior named Draken was attempting to leave Xeroxia over the fact that he was being hunted by Blue Kaizak and his desire to defeat Okmo-Ziko, in which he already was by Jabe without knowing this. He ran into a dancer whom he rescued and took with her. And here we are with the Zynektic World War. Zynektos is seeking to assimilate all those who oppose him in this universe, in an attempt to combat Objector, who has been released by Zyboglius and uses his body to destroy his enemies. It's been roughly a couple months since the events of the Xeroxian Chaos. Squashakus and his Scarlux crew are out looking for Purosk and nothing came about. That is until an organic substance crashes onto the ship and lingers through it. It was none other than Objector himself. This sent Squashakus and his crew on red alert, trying to figure out what's happening and resolve it. But Objector makes his way inside the ship where the ship made sand. The commander asked how he got in and answered he slithered his way in. The Dark Primordial offers Squashakus and his soldiers a deal. They form an alliance to defeat Zynektos and the Obscure Oxtrivium Force, aka the faction Jabe is associated with. Squashakus scoffed at the idea at first, asking what would make him think about joining the most dangerous being in the Zynektiverse. He declared he was heading to Purosk, and Objector followed up on saying exactly that. He even said he'll free Bogoko and get to have Rexos as their kingdom again. This convinces Squashakus to consider the offer, and declares partnership with Objector. The Primordial lingers his body all over the ship and proceeds at a faster rate to the planet Purosk. Somewhere between the Zigra and the Sporolax systems, there lies the Zynekto Palace. Inside the palace is a throne room, where Zynektos resides. Realizing that Objector has been freed, he decides to assimilate all life to help destroy his lifelong enemy, Objector. He instructs Adaclona and Zydrax to carry out his will in capturing their intergalactic enemies. She proceeds outside of the throne room alongside Zydrax, and both talked about eventually meeting Syra somewhere in the Zynektiverse, specifically Purosk. The robot continued to pester the Shadowbringer over her sister relationship with Syra long before she left, until she answered that it's been hundreds of years since they've been together and will be coming after her again. They arrive at the landing base up above the Zynektopolis and lead her troops to invade Purosk. On the planet Purosk, Jabe and her friends enjoy a new period of prosperity. With Kopanazar and Ziboglis defeated, there doesn't seem to be a real threat coming their way. She and Syra discuss about their upcoming promotion due to their success. As they continue to get sentimental over their adoptive sisterhood, booming noises catch her attention. It was an invasion that shook the new Cryolonok city. Syra and Jabe got their things to prepare for battle, but were lost in the destruction of their tower. In the process, Zydeklon enters the scene and fights them. In the midst of the chaos, Adrakan interferes and fights off against the Shadowbringer, but Zydeklon and Zydrax's combined combat prowess overcame the samurai, and were all defeated afterwards. With that said and done, Zydeklon and Zydrax brought them into their ship. All the while, Terexia sneaked her way into the ship, underneath the seat, hoping to get Adrakan and the two other protagonists out of her ship. Zydeklon leaves the new Cryolonok city, with several others following her back to the Zynektic fleet. Upon arriving to a Zynektic ship, Zydeklon brings Jabe, Syra, and Adrakan through hallways which lead to a chamber with Zynektos' hologram in it. She declared their defeat and are planning to assimilate them in their captivity. Zynektos speaks to his captives, and Jabe responds by insulting him as Gramps. Zynektos proceeded to lecture his captives by informing them of their activity at Objector's prison, suggesting that they dug their way into it and taking light Synexity to free him. Jabe corrected him by saying Suboglius did it, which angered the Primordial, no doubt. Suddenly, a booming noise shook the ship and got Syra, Jabe, and Adrakan to escape, though barely, given the chaos Objector brought upon the ship and Squashawkus' army crashing in. As stated from both Chapter 1 and the end of Xerox and Chaos, Squashawkus and the Skarlux didn't get to Purosk thanks to Blue Kaizok's intense clash with the portal. Meanwhile, Terexia makes her way through the halls and evades ferocious Skarlux troops and Objector's inky essence. It was an intense moment. Things couldn't get any wilder. But it did. The battle continues. Squashawkus' army prowls all over the Zynektic ship and fights off anyone in their way. But the goal was to find Zynektos. While that's going on, Jabe, Syra, and Adrakan ran across the halls and finding something to hide or escape to. They eventually did come across an escape pod and got into it. The same is said regarding Sedored, Radalacro, and the others captured in the invasion, but after going through fights from both Objector's and Nektos' sides, the ships collided with each other and flung towards Kelkalog, the same planet where Jabe's crew went into a year prior to this event. The escape pods were flung into various directions. The majority went to Kelkalog, while some went to Xeroxia. Moments after the crash, the ships remained in the dark lake of Kelkalog Swamp. Inside where escape pods remained and were laid there were the black waters are Jabe, Syra, and Adrakan, waking up to see what happened. Jabe wanted to find a way out, but Syra stopped her before doing so and suggested they find out about the situation they're in. As they argued, a Jigrak lingered up to the escape pod with its jaws and pincers out. Adrakan lays his eyes upon it and warned the women about this. They all ducked down in response to the creature lunging onto the pod. They all dived into the water and quietly make their way out of the room while the Jigrak proceeds to rip the pod to shreds. As the heroes make their way out, Syra suggests keeping their heads low while swimming to an exit. The further they fled, the darker the rooms got. Fortunately for them, Adrakan had glowing orange eyes, which allowed them to find an exit. Just as soon as they got to a landing base of the Zynektic ship, the swamp's mossy atmosphere was beginning to dim in a little and easier to see. Slightly so. Upon arriving at a nearby dry area, where a hut full of armor and clothes are, considering their ragged and dirty outfits, Jabe and her friends decided to put on new attires. One Jabe chose was a white bra, greaves, gauntlets, loincloth, and a long silver sword. Syra's had silver bra, golden gauntlets, greaves, splitted skirt, and a spear. Finally, Adrakan's were black gauntlets, greaves, and a loincloth with a giant wedge blade. They were all set and ready for their next move. Syra declares they should start looking for clues regarding Objector's essence. Marks, per se. They all jumped onto a giant tree that fell from the crash prior to the change in clothing and headed that way. While Jabe's team vanished from the scene, two cloaked beings entered the camp where her crew got from. It's revealed that it's Jovan and Kaizen Kurakon, Jabe's parents. They both hope that no one tried raiding their campsite. But while they soon discovered footprints which belonged to Jabe, Syra, and a Draken, noises banged and howled. It was a G-Grak from earlier. This time, it has a team consisted of Varix, Sidorid, Revkis, and Sliver. They all fought against the creature and were initially struggling due to the attempting to eat the two former, as the two latter tried to stop. Kaizen and Jovan joined the fray and fought the G-Grak as well. Its long, centipede-like body hurled all over the swamp and keeps on trying to devour Varix and Sidorid with all the resistance the two men tried with all their will. Sliver has persisted to use her ice magic to slow down the creature, and hoping to kill it, but having to free Varix and Sidorid first. Jovan and Kaizen also aided them in stopping the beast. They eventually got the monster to run up to a tree in which it turned up and rose up further. Once it was all cleared up, Sidorid's crew introduced themselves to the Kurakan parents, as they too do so. But the mention of Kurakan led to Varix questioning the name. Jovan and Kaizen explained that they had a child once long ago and was lost during Kopanasar's invasion. This sent a shock to Sidorid's crew, realizing that Jabe is in fact their child. Sidorid told them everything about what had happened, and that she is in an alliance with them under Syra's care as her adoptive sister. Jovan and Kaizen were overjoyed that their daughter is alive and want to see her. Before proceeding onwards, they found footprints. They concluded that all of these prints may be Jabe, Syra, and the Drakens. They also changed into tribal attire akin to what Jabe and her crew chose. Once they were ready, both Sidorid's team and the Kurakan couple got up to the big tree. Somewhere on a dark planet named Xeroxia, an escape pod laid in a red desert. In it, there were Zaldan, Crimzoid, Tarixa, Radalagro, and Zaldaragro. While the latter were in their own pod separately, the former were stuffed together in another. Tarixa wakes up to see Xeroxia's skyline, familiar with its red wine-tinted color. She brings up her familiarity and isn't looking forward to revisiting it again. Zaldan and Crimzoid woke up shortly after she did and tried finding a way out of the pod that they got into. Eventually, they find a golden button on top of them and pressed it. Spewing it away, they jumped out of the pod. The trio looked everywhere as Tarixa reminds him of their encounter with Blue Kaizak a few months ago, glad by the fact that he's dead. Then a voice spoke behind her, and comes Radalagro and Zaldaragro. As Tarixa mentioned about driving to a chasm recklessly by the winds, all four individuals turned to her with a mention of Primordial. Please refer to my Xeroxian Chaos' novel summary because I won't be repeating that chapter here. Anyways, the crew continued. They discussed about recalling their talk regarding Adwakin and Tarix's entry into Purosk. But as soon as they were about to agree in jumping in, a woman called out to them to stop. Apholux arises from it, the primordial of desires herself. She agrees to help them to Kelkalok and find their friends if they can help bring her to hunt down Zynektos. Darkross wants the primordial of time dead, and so sends her sister to do the deed while he looks after the souls who passed away to be judged by him. As they all stood, Apholux opens up a portal and asks if the deal is worth taking. Just before the answer is said, Crimzoid warns her of incoming beings from the portal, and there, Jabe's crew slammed onto them. Shortly after being ran into, Adraken gets up seeing Apholux. Recognizing his metallic body from before, she embraces him in their second meeting, even going so far as to asking if Jabe was his girlfriend. They both said no, and all discussed what transpired. Even so far as to say Sedhorid and his crew could be lost in Kelkalok as well as Jabe's team had been initially after the crash. Apholux joins the group, and all proceed to the portal ahead, returning to Kelkalok. Upon entering Kelkalok through Aphollux's portal, the combined forces of Jabe and Radelagro's team ran across the giant log until running into the two Kurakans. As they all fell into the lake, Jabe and Kaizen saw each other sitting together. They asked who they were and answered Jabe and Kaizen. As soon as Kaizen mentioned the word Kurakan, Jabe begins to get emotional, standing up side by side. Sarah explained everything to the parents what happened. Refer to the Zynektic Legends chapter 15. But to make this long explanation short, Syra rescues Jabe as an infant from Kopanos' invasion and resides in the Kurudu forest after leaving Zynektos' militia. After all's being said, the family hugged. Suddenly, a red-tinted slime flies up in the sky, echoing a roaring howl up aboard. The creature is Squashakus and the Scarlex troops. Radalagro curses at him and swears retribution for Rexos. Worse still, a familiar entity enters the scene for battle. Kopanazar. Much of his body remained looking the same prior to his defeat in the first novel, but rebuilt and replaced with Zynexity. Jabe's allies helped fending off against the mechanical warlord, now serving Zynektos. and Zatoclone with her Zydrex drone in the mix. The battle intensifies further as a portal to the Zynektopolis opened and entered through. The harder they fought, the more intense the scene got. But while the fight between Jabe and Copenhagen's forces persisted, Injector breaks into the facility and leads Squash Shockus' army to kill anyone in their way. They proceeded further into breaking into Zynektos' throne room, but not before questioning if it is, commenting the fact that the doors look universally the same. Injector, being a primordial himself, concludes that it's his throne room. They all make their way in and greet Zynektos. Both he and Zynektos welcome each other as if a family reunion was taking place, only leading to the mention of using light Zynexity as a means to destroy the chaotic primordial once and for all. What follows is Injector turning against his own allies by trapping them with his slimy goo. They all struggle to get out, but the primordial's power has proven to be too much for them. He and Zynektos went into a battle with each other, as part of the throne room activated its platform as an elevator, going upwards. Zynektos fought back with his scythe, cutting every tentacle popping out to kill him. Yet Injector kept pressing himself further, in which results in their continued fight outside of the landing bay. The Primordial of Time ordered his militia arms to entertain Injector, while he gathers light Zynexity to his scythe and will kill the Dark Primordial. While that's going on, Zynektos drenches his weapon with the antidote and returns, ready to undo something he ought to have done long ago. Realizing much of his base outside was decimated, Zynektos proceeds towards Injector with his weapon upgraded, but luck would turn against the god of time himself eventually. While Zynektos is being hard-pressed by Injector's persistent might, Jabe, Syra, and Rodelicro defeated Copenhagen, found their way to the god of time's throne room, and realized nothing was there except for Squash Shockus and his crew left unconscious. Knowing this, Rodelicro and Zalderico will be taking Squaw with them back to Rexos, while Jabe and her allies follow Injector outside of Zynektos' throne room into the landing bay. The two Comograx flee through the hallway, entering an elevator while keeping Squash Shockus unconscious by banging his head. They take their chances in going to higher levels where any findings of landing docks are possible. Tensions between Zynektos and Injector intensifies even further, that it even gets their attention. They eventually make their way into a landing base with ships inside. Just before they can prepare for finding a ship to take off, Squash Shockus awakes. A fight was sparked between him and the two Comograx he betrayed in favor of Bogakoro, Rodelicro and Zalderico, reminiscing over their hatred of one another. Squash Shockus hopes to take over Rexos in the same fashion Bogakoro did prior to his downfall, but as they fought, the combined might of Rodelicro and Zo made their victory. Not only that, but also destroying his mechanical backpack with blades attached to them. As soon as Squash Shockus was defeated, Rodelicro hears more noises and finds out Yorak and his Roshka army intervenes. He informs Sidora the news and are awaiting his allies to meet him. Jabe, Syra, Apholux, and Adrakan see the landing bays outside, ravaged and torn asunder. Worse, Injector has Zynektos at his mercy. Just before he could avenge himself of the imprisonment done to him, Injector takes notice of Apholux. She swears his and Zynektos will fall to their defeat, only for the chaotic monster to object by saying only the latter will suffer as he triumphs. Injector decides that Zyboglius is no longer needed. He spews him out, reformed to his former self, and cages both him and Jabe. He sends them far away into the planet Xeroxia, while he proceeds to take Zynektos' body for his transformation. Apholux opens a portal to the dark red planet and takes Syra and Adrakan along with her. Crashing onto the planet Xeroxia, Jabe and Zyboglius are lost in the ravaging sands of the desert, but not nearly as bad as the Pirate Master's return. He swears revenge against her for defeating him on Injector's prison. They both fought in the style of the Brawn versus Brain scenario. The Purin flipped and dodged in order to lure Zyboglius into crashing shards of rocks, hoping it would do damage to him. She persisted on this strategy until the Pirate Lord catches her, which of course only leads to Jabe coming on top of Zyboglius' head and held onto his horns as he shook rapidly. As they fought, two primordial figures, Zaudon and Lytris, intervened. Jabe and Zyboglius stopped and wondered why they're here on Xeroxia. In the midst of all this, Apholux arrives with Syra and Adrakan. Zyboglius assumed they'd all want to go into a fist frenzy, but actually, Lytris and Zaudon proposed they ought to join forces to battle against Zynektos and Injector. The pirate scoffed at their suggestion, only for Jabe to come up with a redeeming quality about him. The longer she pondered on the answer, the more impatient Zyboglius got. She answered that he's big and fast, which doesn't seem to satisfy Zhyboglius enough. She came to the conclusion that if either Zynektos or Imjector destroy the Zynektoverse, he'd have no place to conquer or have any minerals to steal for the matter. It wasn't exactly the kind of answer to the question, though it did kindle Zhyboglius' reason to join temporarily. Sarah was reluctant to ally with Zhyboglius in the temporary alliance, but Jay pointed out that planet destroyers are worse than looters, despite them still being scum themselves. They all agree to join forces until they succeed in their task. In the midst of the desert, 6 primordials join together and help transport Jabe, Syra, Zhyboglius, and Adrakan to the Zynektopolis. In the process, they all chanted in taking them there. Jabe assures her allies if Zhyboglius tries anything behind their backs, they would end him. Returning back to the docking bay prior to Imjector sending them off in Chapter 12, Jabe's crew sees a red tornado swirling afar. Syra asks what their plan is to take down Imjector, and eventually Zynektos. Confused by this, the team initially thought there was none. Despite objections Syra makes about the dangerous state of the transformation, Jabe suggests going into a facility ahead where light Zynexity is stored. All the while, York ships fly about at the tornado in preparation to attack. Sadly for them, Imjector has completed his transformation and begins to destroy the ships without mercy. As Jabe's crew make their way into the facility, Jabe plunges herself into the pool and is drenched in light Zynexity. Sparkling all over, she arises and is prepared to take on Imjector. After Imjector finishes his destruction with Yorak's militia, the 6 primordials proceed in battling their relative as a distraction before Jabe can pull off an attack on the Dark Primordial. So much chaos was done on the Zynektopolis. To make matters worse, Imjector defeated the primordials and is prepared to finish them off. Suddenly, Jabe battles the creature, with light Zynexity being drenched to her body. She is blessed with invulnerability and is able to harm Imjector. However, she needs a ship in order to get up to him close. That wasn't until Ziko enters the scene and offers to help find a ship. Due to Imjector's status as an all-knowing primordial, he built a device capable of blocking them out, which gives him the tactical advantage against the chaotic primordial. They all eventually agree to do so and go into functioning ships that were left during the destruction. Several remaining cruisers fly around Imjector's giant form and distract him, with Jabe being the one to go for the kill. She crashes into him and begins to scar the monster. With the light Zynexity being drenched all over her body, she was able to disintegrate him into pieces, which otherwise wouldn't have done so without it. The other cruisers flew around as Jabe proceeded in slicing and dicing Imjector's being. All that remained was Imjector's skull and Zynektos' unconscious body. Taking her sword in hand, she destroys the dark primordial skull, but not before receiving the words of the creature.
You would kill the true father of this universe, the one who brought Zynektos, the primordials, and all of these mortal creations. Without gods to look up to, what can you do to survive? Without me, you are nothing.
This chapter ends with sentient beings and the other primordials celebrating her success in ending Imjector's terror. However, despite Imjector being eradicated from existence, Zynektos arises from his unconscious state. He wanted, or as he puts it, predicted in defeating his creator, only to be called out by Jabe herself for wanting to be right. Jabe threatened him to pay for his infidelities and crimes. Enraged, Zynektos sparked a storm of green energy from his eyes. Sarah joins in the mix alongside Jabe against her father. He tells her she doesn't belong with him, only for her to say she doesn't care. Jabe challenges Zynektos to a duel. If she wins, he is theirs to torment, imprison, or whatever. If he wins, he remains supreme. She takes the deal and fights him. Jabe uses her acrobatic skills in dodging Zynektos' attacks with a scythe. However, he slams her into a ship which she gets damaged.
Now, back into the dirt with you!
Jabe stabs Zynektos in the chest and slashes into his eyes. He was blinded. She ran from the primordial towards her allies as she got up to retaliate. However, Cytoclone pops in front of her and fought in her defense. She lashes out at Sarah as to why she abandoned her long ago while fighting her adopted little sister. Both Syra and Zynektos argued over each other to convince Dataclon to the truth, the former admitting her mistakes and is willing to accept her hatred, only for her to know that their father used them as their body shields, while the latter tries to gaslight the situation by framing her as the villain. Dataclon eventually stops for a moment and begins to question Zynektos about her mother, whose response about what was it about, which got her to keep pressing on him over the question, who is about to have it. The two teamed up in finishing off the primordial of time and pushed him off of the docking bay into deep space, outside of its gravity orb. The team celebrated her success in defeating Zynektos. Shortly after, Ziboglius and Zynektic leave the scene peacefully into a ship cruiser he used and fled away from the Zynektopolis, not even approaching them and just saying, "Have your peace." On Wix Trondra 35-34-13, a ceremony occurs in light of Zynektos' downfall and Injector's demise. There stood Jabe, Syra, Adwakan, and several others standing together. With every passing promotion, they're owed a medal. Jabe looks at her award she received and looked to Syra by thanking her for everything. It would seem as if the Zynektoverse was finally at peace again. Those serving Zynektos have either converted to the side of good or have been vanquished. Kobonazar is locked up, and the Zynektic plague has already been wiped out prior to Wrath of Ziboglius' events. Now that the Zynektic series is done, we can move on to other stuff, not having anything related to this series.
I'm not done yet!
Half a year after the Zynektic World War was released, a friend of mine on Discord created our first edition of Godzilla vs. the Zynektoverse. It features Godzilla fighting off Jabe and Syra in their next adventure in the post-Zynektic Mainline. He'll have his share in the video discussing what got me to work with him on this and whatnot. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time. Feel free to subscribe. Over and out.